it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Ryan. He is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Sex at Dawn, along with his wife, Camilla. Sex at Dawn, How We Mate, Why We Stray, and What It Means for Modern Relationships. His next book, Civilized to Death, Why Everything's Amazing But Nobody's Happy, is due out early 2016. His research is focused on fostering an accurate understanding of prehistoric human life in order to better understand and address contemporary crises. So please help me welcome Dr. Chris Ryan.
The clicker. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Before I get into this, I just want to acknowledge my partner in crime, Casilda, over here, who is the co-author of the book. She doesn't like being on stage, so our deal when we decided to be co-authors, I had to try to convince her. She didn't want to do it. But her one condition was I don't ever have to talk to the press or do any sort of public presentation. So it's enough that I got her here, I'll tell you. I wasn't nervous until Will started talking about disappearing clothing, and now suddenly I don't feel real comfortable. All right, so I'm going to try to be as quick as possible. I've only got 20 minutes to go through material that took us about 10 years to put together. So please forgive me if I rush a little bit. I'm going to talk about something that's both very intimate and public, that's very present and yet rooted in the distant past, something very personal, and yet it's part of politics. And the question is, I think we all agree that we are animals, right? Since Darwin, people have been fighting against the idea that human beings are animals. But at this point, if you don't think humans are animals, then just ignore the rest of what I have to say. But if you agree that humans are animals, then the question is, what sort of animal are we, right? Now, none of this is saying that biology is destiny. None of what I'm saying today is advocacy. So please don't feel threatened if you're completely comfortable being monogamous. We're not saying there's anything wrong with that. What we're saying is that the nature of our species is not to be sexually monogamous. There are huge variation within our species. So for plenty of people, it's completely comfortable, just as vegetarianism is comfortable. But as I've often said, just because you've decided to become a vegetarian doesn't mean that bacon suddenly stops smelling good, right? So that's sort of the crux of what I'm saying. How many of you have seen my TED Talk? Okay, so a few of you know where I'm going with this. This is sort of an uncensored TED Talk. You'll see some things that Ted didn't want me to show. Before I get into this any further, I want to acknowledge that I have bias, just like any scientist has bias. This is the way Canon sees wildlife, and this is the way I see it. It's just the way it is. This is the way I see trucks. I don't know. Maybe you've never noticed that, but trucks often have balls. Okay, so the standard narrative, the line in the book is a fig leaf can hide many things, but a human erection isn't one of them. The standard narrative is the story you've all heard, which is that our species evolved with sort of a deal at the center of our mating system where females trade fidelity to men in return for resources, protection, meat, status, fancy cars, a nice house in the suburbs, whatever it is, whatever your cultural context is, that's the story we've been told. Now, I hope you'll forgive me for being a little crude, but in the book we say that that's the Darwinian narrative of human sexual evolution, which basically posits that all women are prostitutes on some level, right? Because they're trading their sexuality for stuff. What we say is, no, women aren't whores, women are sluts, just like men. Our species has sex for pleasure and, as E.O. Wilson says, for bonding. Now, this is hard for people to get their heads around. Human sexuality is not primarily about reproduction. Most animals, this is crazy. People often say to me, you make us sound like animals. You talk, the way you talk about human sexuality reduces us to animals. No, animals are nowhere near as sexual as human beings are. Animals are embarrassed by us. Most animals, take gorillas for example. Gorillas have sex about a dozen times per birth. Humans have sex approaching 1,000 times per birth. Now, if that number seems high to some of you, don't worry, it seems low to others. I guarantee it. The great conundrum of homosexuality. How can homosexuals exist if they can't have babies? It doesn't make any sense. Well, it makes perfect sense once you understand that the reason that human beings have sex primarily is bonding, is establishing intimacy, is establishing complex social networks. That's what our species does really well. Once you get that central idea, then it makes perfect sense that there's homosexual behavior. Then it makes perfect sense that we have sex in all sorts of ways that can't possibly lead to pregnancy. I'm sure I don't need to spell those out for this crowd. Some crowds I do. Anyway, so that's the central idea. Human sexuality is primarily about establishing relationships. Those guys would love this kind of a church. Funny story. I saw that on the internet and decided I wanted to use it. I was Cassie and I were in Austin, Texas at a paleo conference. I was speaking about paleosexuality, and I thought, why don't I use that funny church thing? That'll loosen people up. So I put it up, and everyone laughed. And then we were driving back to our Airbnb afterwards, and we drove by that church. I had no idea. And we drove by, and it's like, wait a minute, that's that church. It was the same day, the only time I've ever used that until today. So that slide has a special place in my heart. So again, the point I want to really accentuate is that as I talk about these things, I'm not saying that deep, intimate, unique relationships are not natural to our species. I'm simply saying that the long-term sexual exclusivity isn't necessarily part of that. So I'm not saying our ancestors didn't have long-lasting, uniquely fantastic relationships with each other. What I'm saying is that they probably didn't conceive of sexual monogamy as being an integral part of those relationships. That's a cultural overlay. And we can talk about where it came from and why a bit later if you'd like to. Now, how many of you have heard a heterosexual couple having sex? Maybe in a motel. Great, lots of people. Now, raise your hand if the man was making more noise than the woman. Doesn't count if it was you, sir. Sorry. So only a couple of people out of 50 or so. Now, how does it make any sense if human sexuality is, as we've been told, that the female is passive, not really interested in sex, not really enjoying it? It's primarily the male who's initiating and pushing for all these things. Why is it that the female generally makes more noise than the male? And that's across cultures, by the way. And also, very interestingly, among primates that are promiscuous, the female makes more noise than the male. So Darwin was confused by this. Darwin was confused by any indication that the females were inviting sexual contact from the males. No case interested and perplexed me so much as the brightly colored hinder ends and adjoining parts of certain monkeys, Chucky D said. And what he's talking about there is the sexual swellings of chimpanzees and bonobos. Now, Corinne mentioned bonobos. Bonobos and chimpanzees are equidistant from humans. They're by far the most closely related primates to humans. In fact, we're more closely related to chimps and bonobos than they are to gorillas or anything else. So if you go to the zoo and you're looking at a chimp or a bonobo in the cage, you two are more closely related than he is to anyone else, right? In fact, chimps and bonobos are more closely related to us than the Indian elephant is to the African elephant. So we're talking about three very closely related species here. And in the book, we primarily look at chimps and bonobos. We don't really get into birds. It's funny how when people are trying to, like the March of the Penguins, anyone see that movie? It's all about, oh, see, we're supposed to be monogamous. Just look at the penguins. Okay, first of all, we're not birds. I don't know if any of you have ever laid an egg. Secondly, those penguins, even the emperor penguins that are in that movie, are only monogamous for one breeding season. And they live into their 30s, which means they probably have 20 or more sexual partners in their lifetimes. So the reason that females, it's called female copulatory vocalization, by the way, is the technical term for women making more noise than men, or females of different species. The reason this happens is that it encourages sperm competition. In other words, it encourages multiple males to be attracted to the scene of the crime as it's happening and to participate. I don't want to get any more graphic than that, but you got the idea. Sperm competition encourages healthy babies. It creates healthy babies because the sort of evolutionary natural selection takes place at the level of the sperm cells. Now, a woman could be attracted to Brad Pitt, but he might not be the best match for her genetically. Johnny Depp, great guy, probably a lot of fun on a date, but he might not be your best match. This is why, by the way, women will often say, I really like that guy. He's funny, he's cool, he has a good job, he's great, I love his family, but he doesn't smell right. That's a deal breaker. You'll never hear a guy say that, right? She's sexy, she's funny, she's great, the smell's not quite right. Guys just don't say that, at least none of the guys I've ever known. So this is about her body is detecting his suitability for her as a sexual partner on a subconscious level. And I can tell you some great research about that that's really established this. Birth control pills block that ability. So it's very interesting. Think about how many couples have gotten together when the woman was on the pill. They really like each other. They're compatible. They get together. They get married. She goes off the pill. They have a baby, and the relationship disintegrates. They blame it on the baby. They blame it on age. They blame it on all sorts of things. All it is that she had short-circuited this particular mechanism with the pill, and then it got reactivated and rejected the guy. So I can talk about that in more detail if you'd like, but it's quite interesting. Anyway, so human mating behavior includes sperm competition. Darwin was living in the time of this sort of fashion, and he was perplexed by the brightly colored hinder ends of certain monkeys. Go figure. And it's not only limited to Victorian fashion, right? This is the butt bra, which is available at your finer lingerie shops. Now, what's going on there? This is all very primal, right? And we fancy ourselves to be very distant from the animal kingdom, but when you see things through my eyes, believe me. Now, this is a woman from the Pinaha tribe in the upper Amazon. The Pinaha are one of many different tribes in the Amazon and people around the world who have no contact with one another, but who all share the same understanding of where babies come from. Now, you may have thought that everybody knows where babies come from. They don't. In fact, they're Australian Aboriginal people who think that a woman gets pregnant if she steps over a fire, or if she eats the wrong kind of possum, or there are all sorts of stories for this. Because if you think about it, it makes sense. People are having sex, women are getting pregnant. There's no reason to put those two together necessarily, right? These people and many others believe that a fetus is literally made of accumulated semen. So a woman who wants to have a baby who's funny and smart and good-looking, make sure she has a lot of sex with the funny guy, the smart guy, and the good-looking guy to get some of their essence into the baby. And then when the baby's born, all three of those guys will say, yeah, I'm a father. Oh, you're a father. We're all fathers. It's called partible paternity. So this idea that men are very proprietary about women and very obsessed with paternal certainty, this doesn't stand up to scrutiny in the anthropological literature. These are women from the Mosuo tribe in China who have a very interesting system because, again, according to the standard narrative, where men are obsessed with the fidelity of women because they don't want to invest in another man's babies. There should not be these cultures in which paternity is uncertain and no one really cares. The Mosuo have a system in which when a woman becomes sexually mature, she moves into what's called a flower room. Generally, the mother's house is built around a courtyard, and there are rooms around, and they open onto the courtyard, but then they also have a door that opens into the street. She can have anyone she wants spend the night. It can be a different guy every night. It can be two guys. It can be whatever. It's nobody's business. There's no shame. There's no slut shaming. There's nothing. No one talks about there's no gossip about other people's sex lives. That's considered really unclassy or whatever. And the women are completely sexually autonomous, as are the men. So what happens? How does family function, you might say? Well, when a woman gets pregnant, the responsibility for taking care of her baby falls to her, her brothers, and her sisters. The biological father is a non-entity, has nothing to do with it. And that's right. And Cassie reminded me, the only rule is no one can stay for breakfast. So you can have anyone you want in your room overnight, but he's out before breakfast, and we don't want to meet him. So again, another example of a society that shouldn't exist if these assumptions about human sexual nature were true. Marco Polo, by the way, traveled through this area and wrote about these people. They've lived this way for a very long time. And the Chinese government forced them to adopt marriage, and they really fought against it. They finally had to be starved into accepting marriage, and they still only accept it on paper. Okay, so bonobos. Often when you read about human sexuality or the primate origins of whatever, whether it be violence or hierarchy or whatever it is, in the popular press you'll hear about chimps, because chimps are much more broadly studied, and they support a lot of the more negative assumptions about human nature, because chimps can be very violent. There's a lot of infanticide. There's what we might call rape, where it seems that the female is being forced to have sex. There's warfare between groups. So there's a lot of nastiness in chimp society. But you never hear about bonobos. Until very recently, you don't hear about bonobos. The reason for that is bonobos undermine these assumptions about human nature. And yet they're equidistant. I often say chimps and bonobos are like if I have two twin brothers, right? They're very closely related to each other. But then after each other, I'm their next closest relative. Okay? I'm the human, chimp, bonobo. One of them is a gangbanger. He's in prison. He's hurt people and killed people. And that's the one you always hear about. But you don't hear about my bonobo brother who's off, helping the poor in India. Nobody ever talks about him. He's never hurt anyone. He's a wonderful guy, right? But we never hear about him. So that's bonobos. The other reason you don't hear about bonobos is that they embarrass scientists. They embarrass journalists because they're always screwing. If you take the chimps deal, Franz de Waal, who's a great primatologist, said that bonobos, how does he say this? Chimps use violence. What is that line? I forget the line. Chimps use violence to deal. Whatever. I'll mess it up. Basically, what he says is that chimps use violence to deal with conflict, with stress. Bonobos use sex. So if you have a packet of food and you throw it into a cage full of chimpanzees, all hell breaks loose. They fight. The alpha males will take control of the food, and then they'll dole it out to their cronies. If you throw a bunch of food into an enclosure full of chimpanzees, they look at the food, they all have sex, bonobos. They all have sex, and then they share the food. This is the point where I normally throw some apples into the audience. So bonobos are female-centered. Chimpanzees are male-dominant. Bonobos are female-dominant. But interestingly, the way females express dominance is much more collaborative. So it took scientists a while to recognize this, because what they were looking for was the mirror image of male dominance. But that's not how females express power. It's very different from males. Very low stress, very high libido. When there is stress, they use sex to deal with it. Sharing-based society. No one has ever seen a bonobo kill another bonobo. Ever. In captivity, in the wilds. No one has ever seen a bonobo rape another bonobo. So this is extraordinary. And there is no sexually exclusive pair bonding. Bonobos have sex face-to-face. They look into each other's eyes. The females often induce the sexual contact. They have all possible combinations except mother-son, which is interesting. They use it as an antidote to stress and conflict, and they have sex almost as much as humans do in terms of frequency, number per birth. Okay, now, if you need a trigger warning, consider yourself warned. This is bonobos hanging out and someone's throwing apples into the enclosure. So you know what's coming here, okay? So, your closest primate relative, along with chimpanzees. Okay. Next slide. The clicker's not working. There we go. Okay. So this very quickly. This is the only graph I've ever made. I'm very proud of it. What you see here is testicular size of the different species. You can see that the chimp and the bonobo have very large testicles compared to the gorilla, which are tiny. And by the way, a gorilla's penis is that big. So if anyone tells you, gentlemen, you're hung like a gorilla, that is not a compliment. I'm sorry to tell you that. So these are the great apes. Okay, this is the group that we're in. The gibbon is down here at the end, is the only monogamous ape, if you don't count humans. Now look at the size of the human testicles. By the way, this shows that they're outside the body, whereas in the gorilla and the orangutan and the gibbon, they're inside the body. The penis size, and then you see the female facing away from the male. That shows rear entry versus face-to-face, only the human and the bonobo. And also the comparative body size of the male and the female. That's called body size dimorphism, which is another indication of promiscuity in our species. The gorilla, which is a harem-based animal, the male is much bigger than the female because the field of battle of natural selection is between individual males. So the biggest, strongest male tends to win. His genes get passed on because the other males get kicked out of the group. And then you have this sort of runaway effect of males getting bigger and bigger and stronger and stronger. Obviously, humans aren't like that, right? Human male's about 20% larger than the female on average. So that's pretty dry. And this is the point where Ted didn't want me to show this slide. We can see the gorilla has not much going on there. And the bonobo, I don't know if you can make that out. Bonobo testicles are like goose eggs. And then our Italian friend here, when I mean, they made me take this slide out the day before my presentation. It was the dress rehearsal. I'm on stage, this huge 2,500 capacity area, and they were like, well, I know it's funny and it's, everyone, it gets a laugh, but we're afraid Italians will be offended. You tell an Italian he's got big balls. Come on, that is not an insult. But anyway, and by the way, this is a friend of ours. We took this picture in India, and I've been using this, for years now. And he lives in India. He's this hippie traveler guy, doesn't do internet or anything. So I figured he'll never know, and he wouldn't care anyway. And then one day I got an email. I was like, hey, what are you doing showing my balls all over the world? Anyway, okay, so I'm running through this very quickly. I don't know exactly why I included this slide, but okay. And so, all right. I ran through this very quickly so that we'd have a little time for questions. And would I have another 5 minutes? Is that so? Thank you for your attention, and now let's do a few questions. Corin's in charge of the mic here.
All right. I thought I was having mic troubles. Hey, let's give it up for Christopher Ryan. And may I just add that this is wonderful news that he's sharing with us, because what I'm hearing is it takes away the conversation about shame that so many people have about sexuality, and it gives us scientific data just to have a reasonable conversation about the possibilities that are out there for people in ways that we love and connect and form relationships. So this, I think, is very good news for many of us, whether we act like bonobos or not. We can support a bonobo friend.
Just don't act like chimps.
So yes, questions. I'm going to run the mic to you. I saw this hand first. Hold it real close.
Yeah, in the cultures that you talked about that are where the women have shameless sex, yay. What are the rape rates and the rape culture in those societies or cultures?
Well, rape is a very difficult thing to study because it's so culturally defined. Like, for example, in chimpanzees or other animals, some people say dolphins rape, but it's so hard to know what's going on in their minds, right? It depends on the society. The Mosuo, for example, is 0. There's no word for rape in their society. And most of the South American societies that we looked at, it's also extremely low or non-existent as far as we know. But again, these are cultures that, maybe 1 or 2 anthropologists have spent time with them. The Pinaha, for example, have a very unusual language. So they've only been studied by 1 or 2 people long term who were able to master the language. So, a lot of this is speculative. That's why I always start with the, my bias and all that. But when you look at the reports from these societies, you see that generally in forager, hunter-gatherer societies, women's status is very high. They're involved in political decisions. It's a consensus-based society, so they're very free to decide who they're with, who they're not with. Marriage is not contractual. Marriage is even, what is marriage, right? The anthropologists say, she moves her hammock and puts it next to his, they're now married. So they say, oh, there's marriage in this society. Well, there's no exchange of property. There's no sense of expectation of sexual exclusivity. There's no responsibility to take care of the children as a couple. How is that marriage? And then she takes her hammock and puts it next to her mother's again, and they say, oh, now they're divorced. So I think because of the sort of blanket, universal high status of females in pre-agricultural societies, something like rape is going to be very rare.
You said near the beginning of your talk that you could tell more about the reasons why we've been living so differently than, you know what I'm saying?
Sure, yeah, the advent of agriculture and monogamy. Basically, the argument we make in Sex at Dawn, which is an argument that Friedrich Engels made in the 1800s and others have made since then, is that sexual monogamy and the sort of monogamous nuclear family is an economic institution that came into the human cultural lexicon along with property. Because hunter-gatherers don't have property. They don't have private property. Everything is shared. Food is shared. There are complex rituals involving the distribution of meat. If I go out and shoot a deer, bring that deer home, the standard narrative presumes that I'm going to share that meat only with my wife and my kids. And that's why I'm so obsessed with her fidelity, because I don't want to share my resources with someone else's kids and all that. This is a very blinkered economic view of human relationships that doesn't apply to hunter-gatherers. When you look at the way hunter-gatherers live, I bring a deer back, everybody shares it, just like bonobos. Now, why? Because if I don't share it, you're all going to hate me. And some days I get a deer, some days you get a deer. Doesn't make sense. And we don't even have refrigeration. What am I going to do with the deer? Casilda grew up in Africa, and she said there's an expression in Africa, the best place to store surplus food is in your friend's stomach. People are still thinking that way, right? So this cooperation, it's just a way of mitigating risk. It's no more noble savagery than paying your insurance premiums, right? But because we use the term Flintstoneization in the book, which is this tendency to look at the way things are and then project it into the past, right? And that's what anthropologists and archaeologists have been doing for a long time, assuming that people in the past think the way we do. And it turns out that if you look at pre-agricultural societies who live the same way our ancestors did 10, 15, 20,000 years ago, they're not concerned with private property. So if you look at, for example, the Old Testament, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. It seems like they're saying respect your neighbor's marriage. But if you read it in context, it says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his house, nor his servants, nor his ox. It's thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's property. And the wife becomes part of the property of the man when you have private property that needs to be passed on to one's sons. Therefore, you need to control the sexual behavior of the female to make sure those are your sons. If you don't have private property, who gives a damn, right? And you're living in a small band society where everyone knows each other. Everyone loves each other's kids. Women typically breastfeed babies without even thinking about it. If a baby starts crying, they just pick up the baby and breastfeed it. They're not thinking, oh, it's not my baby. I'm not going to touch it. That's not the way it works. So I hope that answers it more or less. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay. The U.S. is growing more and more into a sharing economy. I'm curious, what leads the other? Will the sharing economy lead towards more equality and sexual openness, or does the cultural change within this country lead to more of a sharing economy?
You got me. I don't know. I hope it goes that direction, however it gets there. I don't claim to understand the mechanisms in that. In the hunter-gatherer societies, sharing economy is very easy because everyone knows one another, right? So here, we're setting up these systems like Uber or, Airbnb or whatever, where the sharing economy is based on software and we don't know each other personally. So I'm not sure how that's going to work. Like dating apps seem to be leading to more promiscuity. But when I talk about prehistoric promiscuity, it's not the kind of promiscuity we're talking about today, because it would be impossible to have sex with someone you didn't know 20,000 years ago. You knew everybody. You'd spent your whole life with this group, right? Or at least your whole adult life. So there wasn't this kind of go out, meet someone, have sex, never see them again. That kind of promiscuity didn't exist. When we talk about prehistoric promiscuity, we're talking about 50 to 150 people who are living together, traveling together, and most of the adults probably having 3-4 different sexual relationships going on at any given point in their lives. On average, there are studies showing 7, 8, 12, and the women, by the way, have the highest numbers, not the men. But that's what I'm talking about. Ongoing, just like friendships. It's funny how we assume that sexuality is this very concentrated, exclusive kind of relationship, but we don't assume that about any other relationship in our lives. We don't, if someone has a second child, you don't say, oh, now you're going to love the first one half as much. Right? It never occurs to us, right? You can't be my friend if you're his friend. Doesn't occur to us. So there's some weird thinking around sexuality, I think. Yes.
We have room for 2 more questions. I'm just going to come here and here because those are the first 2 hands I saw.
My name's Jeff. What you just said about our thinking that we don't have any other relationships that we assume are exclusive. I was thinking that most people actually do have an exclusive relationship with one person, and that's their employer. And I was wondering if you had any comments about the similarity between those and the standard narrative. Thanks.
I haven't had a job since the 80s, so I'm probably the wrong guy to ask. I think, and sort of relating to the previous question, I think that a lot of people now are questioning that exclusive relationship, either sequentially, right? Most people now don't expect to go get a job at General Electric and then retire 40 years later, right? They're going to have lots of different employers over their lifetime. Or a lot of people are shuffling things around where they have 3 or 4 different consulting gigs, with different companies, or do different things in different parts of their lives to pay the bills. So I think there is sort of a movement, at least in the United States, toward spreading that out a little bit. Another exclusive kind of relationship we have is with our parents, right? And I think that that is replicated in our sexual relationships, in the sense that when you're raised in a nuclear family, your brain is configured in a way where you expect everything to come from 1 or 2 sources, right? Either just mom or mom and dad, but one source, one parental source. And so it's sort of, in some sense, in a psychological sense, it's sort of normal that we grow up with that bonding expectation that one person is going to supply us with everything we need as adults. Whereas in foraging societies, where you grow up and all of the adults are considered your parent, right? In most of these societies, child refers to any adult man as father, any adult woman as mother. Now, the kid knows who his biological mother is, not necessarily who his biological father is, but still, any adult can discipline a child. Any adult will pick up a crying child, will protect the child from a predator or whatever. So when there's that sort of shared parental relationship, again, it sort of makes sense that these people grow up with a sense of sexual and emotional needs will be met by several people as well. So these things do replicate themselves. I'm not sure about the employer example, but as I said, I'm not really qualified to speak on that. Yes.
Last question, and may I have the band go ahead and start queuing up?
It seems that one of the necessary consequences of what you said is that things like jealousy, possessiveness, and the like are socially constructed. They're not integral to human personality.
Yeah, I would say the way I generally respond to that point is to say that I think insecurity is instinctive. That's built into pretty much every mammal, right? Like we've got cats in our place in Spain, and you can just see like a cat will get a really nice spot in the sun and doesn't want to give it up, and so there is an instinct or a natural response not to want to lose something that you value. So that I think is inborn, but having that be expressed in terms of feeling a sense of ownership over someone else's sexuality, that's very much culturally constructed. I think if you look at the relationship to property in hunter-gatherer societies, one of the problems that anthropologists often run into is they'll show up to study a society and they'll have their trunk of supplies for 6 months or whatever they're going to be out there. They've got all their chocolate bars and their peanut butter and their cameras and their notebooks and all that. And they often complain that the foragers steal everything. But they don't steal everything. They don't understand the idea that that's only yours. You're showing up here. You're eating our food. You're asking us a bunch of intrusive questions. You're hanging out by our fires. You want us to teach you everything, and you won't share your damn chocolate bars? What kind of, who are you anyway? So this understanding of property, this assumption that we all value private property and we're very, ownership oriented as a species, that's simply not true. And I think that can be applied to our relationships with other people as well. Thank you very much. See you later.
thanks to Chris and Casilda for coming out and joining us today. And again, I'm so thrilled to get the messages out there that reduce shame, reduce guilt, reduce stigma from helping people just to live the kinds of lives that they want to live and to be the kinds of people that they want to be. So this is a message that we can all embrace and support people around.